This episode was sponsored by Critical Dice and the Endless Bag of Dice.
Welcome to the Compendium, a resource designed to help you spend less time learning D&D and more time actually playing. Thank you for joining us this week on the Compendium. Unfortunately, this episode might only be half as good as other episodes are. I don't know what you think.
No.
It may not measure up. I'm trying to think of good half puns here because this week we are talking about half elves. It's our first foray into half races, which I'm excited about because I think there is, beyond just the race itself, some stuff to unpack with the idea of running a half race. And so let's go ahead and dive into it. And first of all, let's talk a little bit about why we decided to start with half elves. I mean, first, one of the things is because we've already talked about elves. So that makes things a little clearer to begin with.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we started with half elves because they're the best. I mean, just demonstrably, they're the best.
But they're only half as good as real elves? No.
It's not. No. It's not that they're half as good, it's that they're twice as good. It's not divisive, it's multiplicative. It's they get the best of both worlds. They get the best of their human parent and the best of their elven parent. Because, they don't live... What's really cool about half elves is that they have the ambition and wanderlust and kind of inquisitive nature of humans. But they have also like the refined senses and the love of like art and doing things well, even if it takes a long time, and that connection to nature in the Feywild of the elves. So they have both of those things kind of put together, but it's not without its drawbacks. But both lore-wise and mechanically speaking, they are probably one of my favorite races because of that. They're pretty great.
So have half races always been around since the first iteration of D&D, or was this something that was introduced a little bit later on in the timeline?
I feel like if it wasn't from the very beginning, it was pretty early on, because I feel like half elves have been around for a long time, and there were some other half races back in the day that didn't really make it to the present. So yeah, I'm just going to say it. So there used to be a half elf, half dwarf race. And they had a beautiful, wonderful name. They were called a dwelf. Or if there was a group of them, they were dwelves. You could even have 12 dwelves.
I feel like, you know how a bunch of, ravens or crows are called a murder? I feel like dwelfs need their own bizarre acronyms for a gaggle of that, or something. I don't know.
Yeah, they'd be called an awkward of dwelves.
There you go. That is such a weird combo. I feel like they're so counterintuitive. I love it, but it's just funny when you think about that. So dwelves really have been around for quite a long time. So half races are not necessarily something new, but they are limited, right? So there's only a couple of different half races that are canon within the guides. Most of them that are presented are full races, like tieflings, dragonborns, humans. They're not necessarily split this same way.
Right. I mean, I think in the player's handbook, it's just half orcs and half elves. Although I think there's some other things that kind of come out later, if you think about Aasimar and Genasi, and even the Goliaths. So they're half giants, half genies, and half angels for the Aasimar as a kind of counterpoint to the tieflings. So they're in there. They're just not necessarily called that. And then, which I can't wait for us to do this, there's also all of the half animalistic races, right?
Oh yeah, the Tabaxi and the
Aarakocra, yeah, where they're just something people. They're lizard people. They're lizard people or bird people or cat people, right? And then there's the what is it? Not is it the shifter? From Eberron, where they can kind of they're half werewolves, kind of almost, or half druid wild shape characters. It's kind of interesting. So
I wonder why these half races got the title of half elf. Why didn't they get their own name then? Because there are these other half hybrid, if you will, hybrid races that just have their own title. I think it's interesting that, and maybe that's where my confusion came in, is because it's specifically titled a half elf, whereas these other races are not titled a half cat or a half human, or I don't know, whatever way it would go.
Well, maybe it's because a couple of reasons. One is legacy. Like, this is what they've been called for a very long time, and so they just kept it. Number two, they're half of another mortal race that is already sentient, as opposed to, say, like an Aarakocra, where like a half bird, it's not implicit that it was another like humanoid sentient species or race, whereas with the orcs and the elves, it is. So I think that's part of it too. And then also, they were made back when they were bad at naming things, and all the newer ones have good names. Because all this came out in later editions and later books. I mean, that it's the same reason why they're poisonous snakes, not venomous snakes in the monster manual. So, but poisonous means that they're dangerous to touch, but they're not. They're dangerous when they bite you. That's called venom. Anyway, so they just, they get it wrong sometimes. But I think that's kind of why. It's just a legacy thing.
So let's dive into some of the nitty gritty about half elves and what makes them so unique. And I mean, again, on the surface, you hear half and you think that it's going to be worse because you only get part of something, right?
Yeah.
But it's not. It doesn't actually turn out that way. You might actually want to play a half elf instead of a full elf, depending on what you're looking for in a character.
Yeah, and I almost always do, because they make great bards as well. So, unsurprisingly, I'm a little biased. But the first thing you have to know about the half-elves is, much like halflings and even gnomes in the player's handbook, or even tieflings, they don't come from large kingdoms or dynasties or like a big, nation of all half-elves, because of their dual nature of typically having a human parent and an elven parent. They are the half-breeds of other things. And so they're going to pop up in human settlements and kingdoms, and elven settlements and kingdoms. So they are kind of just a mix of those things. And what's really interesting is they're kind of like, have you ever read the kid's story, The Pig Who Could Fly?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So he's not welcome in the sty, and he's not welcome in the nest, right? And that's kind of the half elves is just like that, where when they grow up in elven kingdoms, it starts out okay, but they mature a lot faster than their full elven counterparts, and so they're ready to go out and rule the world. And their friends they grew up with kind of stayed kids, but they also don't live as long as the elves do, and so they're like, well, I want to go and do stuff, and so they're a little malcontent. But if the ones that grow up in the human realms, they grow up just fine with their human counterparts, but they can watch multiple generations of friends and loved ones pass away while they are barely touched by the rigors of time. And so it can be kind of lonely. And also, while they have the ambition and inventiveness of the humans, it's tempered, it's a bit more refined. And so they may find it a little uncouth in the ambitions and imaginings of their full human, compatriots. And so there's always going to be this pull to the other side. The grass is always greener kind of idea, but they're never truly welcome in either one. But that being said, in my mind, the way that they're built mechanically would make them almost as everyone's second best friends, like how the humans are described, even more so because they have that high charisma. They're so good at everything, and they could kind of get along with everybody. But the book does describe them being a bit more ostracized, like they would never really ever be truly welcome in an elven kingdom, and they would never truly be satisfied in a human kingdom. And so there is these stupendous gifts that come from being a half elf, but there's always going to be this undercurrent of discontent.
Mm-hmm. Like that, just feeling like you never really belong anywhere. I like in the player's handbook that it starts off by basically talking about that divide that they walk on, by saying that to humans, half elves look like elves, and to elves, they look like humans. And so no matter where you go, you're not necessarily, and that's the thing too, is like what strikes me there is not only that walking that divide, but you're always kind of being judged about what your appearance looks like. You're not just being like, oh, you're just a you. It's like, oh, you look like a human, or oh, you look like an elf. I don't know. That really strikes me.
No, absolutely. So like my mom is from Minnesota, but she married my dad and they moved to South Carolina where my dad's from. And when her family would call or visit, they would always say what a horrible accent she had picked up. But everyone that she encountered in the South called her a Yankee because all they could hear was that northern Minnesota, oh yeah, don't you know, thing going on. And so she was also in a similar way, just never truly of any of the worlds, even though I didn't think she sounded Southern, nor did I think she sounded like, a Minnesotan. But that's just kind of the trade-off that you get. So I can easily understand how that would be.
So would you say that half-elves, and this is going to be kind of a weird question, but out of curiosity, would you say that they're usually first generation half-elves, or are they like generational, where this is like the 10th generation of mom and dad were both half-elves versus mom was an elf and dad was a human, or vice versa?
I think it is more common that they end up being the offspring of one of each, but it is also possible for them to have two half-elf parents. I feel like that's not as common, but depending on the world you're playing in, who knows? But that's kind of how it's presented in the player's handbook. But just like you can have a Labradoodle by having a Labrador and a Poodle be the sires, but you also could have a whole, lineage of Labradoodles that have always been Labradoodles.
Well, what's funny that you bring up, it's funny that you bring that up because I think I've told you this. I used to be a dog trainer. In one of my forays. And what's interesting about Labradoodles, or the like doodle breeds, is that it's usually only second or third generation where you get the hypoallergenic feature, which is what most people buy them for, is that poodles, people that are allergic to dogs aren't allergic to them. So that's actually what made me think of it, is like, is there some kind of lineage change or something that occurs in like the 4th, 5th, 6th, 10th generation? Or is it something that it only occurs in this first generation and maybe ends up like kind of dissipating down the line? Or like, how does that situation work? So that's funny you brought that up as the example, because that's kind of where my mind was anyways.
Yeah, and we have a Yorkapoo, so it's the same kind of thing. So maybe that's why it's on my mind. But yeah, that'd be really interesting and to see how those genetic traits ebb and flow over the generations. And I mean, that means it is possible to have an entire extended family and generations and lines of half elves that could potentially become a tribe, a nation, a kingdom. So I would love to see that kind of thing.
And it would make a lot of sense if they don't feel like they belong anywhere. Right.
Yeah, to find others like them to kind of commiserate with.
Someone else understands me.
Right, exactly. And perhaps that's one of the hooks that a person could use when saying, okay, well, why is my character, my half elf, why are they an adventurer? Is because there's an element of feeling like you're from the land of misfit toys. And so you find a bunch of other land of misfit toys, a John in the box instead of a Jack in the box, a doll that doesn't work quite right, and that kind of stuff, where you're like, okay, well, this is a dragonborn who's lost his honor. This is a gnome who doesn't like building things, and this halfling's awfully violent. He's our barbarian. Like, so no one here works the way they're supposed to. And I find oddly a kinship with these leftovers, these goobers, and they're my found family. And that's always a nice trope to have in those kinds of adventures, the found family trope.
So before we move on to diving, we've already started to brush the surface of like culture and whatnot, but before we kind of move to that segment, there is one thing that I want to dialogue with you about, which is that I think the understanding is that when you've got a half something, the other half is human.
Yes.
And
yes, that is the conceit.
I don't like that. I don't know why, but that bothers me. Is like, why? Why does it have to be human? Why does it assumption that human is, especially because humans are like the odd ones out. They're the newest people in this world. And so I feel like if you're going to have a half, it would be from an older race that has actually been around longer. So let's unpack what that is. And then also, I'd like to get your thoughts on what if you want to play something that's a half elf, but the other half isn't human? What would you do, or what would you recommend for a player or a DM to discuss about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I hear your point about maybe one of the older races, but I think that's actually a good argument for the other side of why it is most commonly humans, because humans are the newer kids on the block in most of these worlds, and they're the most adaptable, right? They're the ones that can pivot and shift and change with what's going on. And so it would make sense to me in my mind that, oh, okay, well, they're the ones who are the most compatible with a tiefling or with, with the elves or the dwarves or the halflings or whatever, that perhaps they don't talk about it in this way, but their genetic code has the most similarities of all the other things. It just, for me, that makes the most sense, because there's not something so strong presenting like a tiefling's red skin and horns and innate magic ability, or the innate luck or fire breathing of a dragonborn that's going to really clash with the essence of a fey touch creature like an elf. Whereas with humans, you have a very blank slate. There's not going to be a lot of genetic conflicts or attribute conflicts. And so I can see why that would be that way. But as far as like making your own, like we joked before about the Dwelves, and even in the Tolkien lore, the hobbits, halflings, they say descended from men. Now in D&D they don't do that, but there's a little nod that there is something going on with the halflings as well. I would say is you just kind of think about what is the theme of that race, and then find ways to incorporate the two themes you're doing. And so just like how the Player's Handbooks talks about the half elves as being the best of both of their parentages, of the adaptability, ambition, and ingenuity of humans, that's the theme. And then the love of art and the keen senses being the theme for the elves, you mix those two things together. And when we get into the stats, you'll kind of see that being brought out. Whereas if you wanted to do something like a tiefling dragonborn, I love that, because you've got the theme there is like, say, like innate magic, right? And them being created by something that is not quite a god, perhaps, but something very old and very powerful. Those are very similar themes. And so, especially if you're going with, Red Dragon or Gold Dragon or something, where you've got the fire element going on, then you have it with the tieflings as well as their kind of stock configuration. I could see those things kind of coming together, that they would keep their infernal legacy or elements of it. Perhaps they would gain the fire breathing as well, but maybe the flavor there is that the red skin has just like a hints of scales, but not true scales, and perhaps the
they have
face.
A tail.
Oh, they would totally have a tail.
There's a way to give your tiefling a tail, folks.
There you go. But yeah, exactly. And I would love that, and because they both are prone to having kind of like tieflings have horns. Dragonborns have like the hint of horns. It's almost like that crest you see around like a bearded dragon or some of the different kind of lizards in our world, where the skull shape may be more humanoid and less dragon shaped, but like maybe the horns are more pronounced, or there's, instead of hair, it's just like a field of short stubby proto horns along with the two large prominent ones on the top. I would see that very easily, and I really like that. I've played with someone who made a homebrew race of half tiefling, half dragonborn, which I thought was really cool.
I like that. Yeah, I think another reason why the idea of like why human is like so predominant, I think it twinges back to that conversation we had in our very first discussion into the topic of race, and the idea of our race is racist, right? Mm-hmm. And just like making the assumption that, oh, well, it's human. And so I think like that's definitely forefront on my mind. And I think it's important too, as a player, to understand that there's like a conscious reason there. And it's not just because, well, of course, humans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, yeah, I like that. And that's the thing, is that we talked about this at the very beginning in this whole kind of like arc talking about the races, is that race in our world is misidentified, because we're all human, but we like to divide ourselves up for good or for ill, typically for ill. But we're all the same species. We're all the same thing. We just have some very slightly different characteristics.
Right.
Whereas in D&D, these are really
very different
things. That's a bird man and that's an orc. Come on. They're not even close, right? Dragonborns are reptilian and the tieflings are demonic, and then the elves, they're from the Fae. They're not even considered to be humanoids.
They're not from around here.
No, they ain't. But so it really is different. And so I've actually seen worlds on like podcasts and things where they don't have half races because they're just like, no, these are different kinds of creatures, and they're just not, and they're just mutually exclusive. The genetics don't work that way. There can be relationships, marriages, all that kind of stuff, but it's just never going to produce a offspring. What is it? Donkeys and horses, they make mules, but then mules can't breed with any of the other things. So it just doesn't work that way. Mm-hmm. That's a weird example, I know, but
we're full of weird examples in this episode. Let's just keep going with it. Let's own it.
Let's just go for broke. Lean into it. I don't want to. I'm scared. So yes, I mean, it's just very interesting when you think about all these things. But the goal of D&D, as always, is to have fun. And if you like doing this kind of like hot swapping with characteristics and thinking up the lore that would make those things make sense, is that fun to you? Go for it. I love the homebrew stuff that people come up with because it's always very, very interesting and just makes for great storytelling. So as always, do what you want, but here's what it says in the books is kind of the idea.
Thank you guys so much for joining us this week on the Compendium, where we are talking about all things D&D, helping you spend less time learning and more time actually playing. This episode was sponsored by the Critical Dice and the Endless Bag of Dice, where you can get a new set of dice delivered to your door every single month for as little as $6.99. Click on the link in the show notes to learn more. Make sure you subscribe to our channel if you enjoyed listening in this week so that you know every time we push out a new video. And also leave a comment below if you learned something new in this episode that you didn't know before. Thank you so much for listening in. We'll see you guys next time.